Last time on Super Bunny Hop.
Grant, I'm taking you off active duty.
What gives you the right?
My rank gives me the right. What the hell are you doing?
I'll miss him, Sarah. What is it? Why can't you look at me?
I have to refit my suit.
My friend, it's Creole.
Bastard. Wait. I'll share something with you. I'll tell you something. I'm coming for you. Nicola, App Io. We'll meet again.
Yes. Just long enough for me to put you in the ground where all the clan filth belong.
I'm coming.
I'll get my shovel.
When planet Earth gets taken over by socialism, the besieged Jupiter colonies retreat to Alpha Centauri, where the effort to colonize its two habitable planets are under constant threat from piracy and the hegemony from Earth. Facing this danger, the disparate clans of New Hope and Thatcher form Strike Force Centauri, a weird old DOS game nobody remembers that maybe they should. Terra Nova Strike Force Centauri is a tactical sci-fi action game released in 1996 that somehow rides the line between a mech sim, a flight sim, and a surprisingly fast FPS sandbox. I somehow got a hold for the demo for this game as a child in '97, and it might as well have served as a cornerstone of my early education. This was a lot of firsts, both for me as a kid and the industry at the time. It was the first time I had seen a fully diegetic interactive HUD. The first time I really got to sweep across a giant outdoor landscape sandbox with one particular objective in mind. It was the first time I encountered a deliberately fragile player character who dies in a couple hits. It was the first time I played with friendly fire and complex AI in fully destructible environments. And for much of the rest of the industry in 1996, this was the first time all of those features got to work together well in 3D. What was most impressive at the time was that this was probably also the first game where people could give an AI squad mate a complicated order to go take care of a problem on their own, and it just worked. I swear, I replayed the original Rainbow Six a couple years ago, which was a generation ahead of this game, and you gotta micromanage your squad mates with way more minutiae there than here. Though the complexities of navigating an urban labyrinth are probably far harder for AI to handle than the flat open ground of Strike Force Centauri, but what separates this game from any other generational half-step action game forgotten with time is the pedigree of Looking Glass Studios, the same group that brought us Thief and System Shock, whose Austin development house began the careers of people who'd later go on to start Deus Ex, Dishonored, and Prey. And as unlikely as it is, you can kinda see that influence here in Strike Force Centauri, because Strike Force Centauri peters awfully close to what Warren Spector calls an immersive sim. A self-admittedly highfalutin and pretentious word describing games where dynamic and open-ended rule systems, level design, AI behaviors, and even physics combine to make sure no two playthroughs are alike, while using those mechanics to ramp up the realism and believability a notch ahead of what was standard at the time. Then again, it was years earlier when System Shock let you pick up and misplace objects all around the map, which was itself years after Ultima Underworld populated its world with friendly NPCs, giving the impression that not every living creature in the world wants to immediately fight you to the death on sight. So, the more conventional action-packed shooting of Strike Force Centauri doesn't exactly fit Looking Glass's highbrow MO, but the variety of open-ended tools it provides and the emergent gameplay that results sure do. You've always got some set mission objectives, some of which can be deliberately misleading or change mid-mission in ways that always seem more believable than what was standard at the time. After spending tens of minutes memorizing a detailed plan before you're thrown out into the open-ended radio silence of the level, sometimes you'll just get bad map data from command and you gotta work around that problem yourself. Sometimes the transports you're supposed to be meeting will already be captured by enemies and dragged away to the corner of the map you gotta find yourself. Sometimes you'll get ambushed before getting to the objectives and the game won't ask you to be a hero about it. You'll just call a dropship down, get out of there, and completely forget about the objectives as the story will continue to progress just fine. And sometimes you'll bring an electronics expert to repair some gizmo, he'll forget to bring the right kind of screwdriver or something, and because of that, the mission will be aborted and you'll have to fly back home only to begin it all over again as the next valid mission in the story.
I've talked with Gax and he assures me he knows what went wrong and how to fix it. Head back in and finish the job.
These are all narrative beats evoking something more immersive about this simulation, but what's more important is that the gameplay does the same. The control scheme is basically System Shock, but the sluggish tankiness of your looking and movement feel far more at home in the helmet of a metal exoskeleton than in the meat and bones of a sweaty hacker. And more importantly, the limited range of your movement and even the low resolution visibility play into the combat. Intel tools and complex map data fill in the blanks of your painfully slow turning speed, and the vast distances you cover explain enemies disappearing into the pixels along with everyone's fairly close weapon ranges. But spotting them ahead of time is so important, because compensating for all those limitations is the rewarding struggle of this type of gameplay. It requires learning a playstyle that still feels unique and fresh to this day, getting into a routine of scanning an area with a drone ahead of time and firing a volley of enemy detectors over the hills to paint targets before they become visible. With controls this complicated and health bars this fragile and turning and looking speeds this slow, combat is usually won by whichever party has the element of surprise. And using the sensors and readouts and radars all over your HUD to track enemies and navigate the terrain, rather than just using your eyes and mouse pointer, is still a unique sensation. You will be blinded if you don't take those extra steps. In addition to all those intel tools comes a squad fully capable of using those tools themselves. Teammates can be split up and spread across the map, elaborate maneuvers can be executed, and while the interface for all this is certainly dated, it's not exactly unfriendly. This is a game of tactics and logistics, and that simulationist flavor to it means that it makes sense that every directional waypoint has got to be placed yourself. Every extraction has to be called in yourself, ahead of time at that, and teammates aren't scripted to just complete objectives by themselves. And managing all that, logistics, tactics, and intel on top of your limited visibility and movement, all presents a compelling mental challenge before the visceral, gratifying reward: the combat. Unlike the Deus Exes and System Shocks of the 90s, Strike Force Centauri's more conventional action-packed focus ditches the dice rolls for combat that is far twitchier than you might expect. It's fast, it's tactical, it's decisive, and it's still genuine good fun, thanks to dimensions of verticality provided by one of the most ridiculously empowering video game jetpacks I've ever seen. And yet, it's still smart. Projectile weapons can have their range extended from elevation or from gravity depending on where you are on which planet you're firing from, and smoke cover can become hard cover for beam weapons. So consider the qualifications it takes for being one of War Inspector's immersive sims, and then consider how there's very little scripting or linearity directing you to complete these objectives here. Also consider how the playstyle and tactics required immerse your unscripted improvisational combat routines into the story and world themselves. For example, and this is kind of a minor spoiler for a poorly remembered weird old DOS game from 22 years ago, I noticed a string of missions ending with those aforementioned ambushes during a subplot in the story that revolved around a spy somewhere in the base sending plans to the enemies. When I received a briefing for a solo mission that'd follow a road deep through a steep ravine, I had my suspicions. I broke away from the advised plan and default loadout to wear heavy armor instead, and climbed straight over the ravine instead of into it. I sent a drone to scan the area around the objective rather than head to the objective itself, and sure enough, there was an ambush party waiting. But this time, I was prepared, even though the briefing plan and recommended loadout would have turned it into a literal suicide mission. So the game's narrative aspect of world building follows you from the menus into combat. You can read into the biases of emails and articles to predict what'll happen next. You will read news reports about your own missions. You'll skim pages of expository flavor text that's tiring but still fascinating to skim through. Terra Nova's fiction is not exactly filled with revolutionary sci-fi concepts, but what is though is seeing its story progression married so strongly to gameplay that usually seems so far away from that stuff. It's so good. This game is still so good, but there is one weak link.
That little rat used to bug the hell out of me. Following me around, pestering me. But I kinda got used to it.
Oh, Miss Sarah. What is it? Why can't you look at me?
She's just upset.
90s FMVs are kind of adorable now, I thought. Up until I started getting the feeling that bad production values here were genuinely spoiling what was a genuinely cool world-building experience. It's weird how concise and elegant the writing in this game comes off up until you're watching someone say it with their face.
I'm Nicola, App.io. I'm looking for Commander McPherson.
You found him, son. Drop and give me 20.
Sir?
What? The pirates steal your ears? Better yet, make it 40.
It's not so much that the acting is hilariously unconvincing, it's that the entire execution, placement, and pacing of these things is pretty much a mess. The actors' movements don't match their lines, their tone doesn't match their lines, their characters are undefined and unmemorable, and the writing will suddenly seem confused over how much exposition we're supposed to know, especially because your time between missions is spent with these irrelevant tone-setting vignettes that almost appear out of order.
Alright. Don't start with that. What? This? Or how about this? SFC, this is Commander McPherson. I want everyone in briefing now.
By the time you actually watch the FMV of the gang finding out that spy, the mission where you actually did the work to find the spy was like 4 missions before the cutscene happens. And when reading dev diaries and interviews behind the game, explanations start to become apparent. The game's development was led by an unnamed programmer who was really hyped to make a future space mech milsim as realistic as possible, but for some reason he left the project after years of a development process that started as early as 1992. But no one else at Looking Glass was quite as excited about this game as its original programmer was, but the rest of the team continued to finish it anyways, overhauling it to be faster and more arcadey to their tastes. But then, in 1994, the flashiness of Wing Commander 3's live-action cutscenes pressured the studio into having their own full-motion videos to keep up. A scriptwriter was outsourced to think up some words for these actors to say, but frequent mission redesigns meant that scripts had to be rewritten along the way, adding time and money to the game's already delayed development. The game was delayed off course by 1 year, but it was probably the most cataclysmic year in gaming's history, from 1995 to 1996. Within that year, 3D acceleration had taken off. This was the year that gaps Chrono Trigger to Mario 64, and the way games were made and played fundamentally changed almost overnight. By the time Terra Nova had come out, the fully polygonal MechWarrior 2 had been on the shelf for months, and games like Quake and Shattered Steel were just a few months away. So although Force Centauri reviewed pretty well, it was competing against far more visually impressive games while suffering the same Looking Glass tax every other one of their games did. Kids just wanted to buy Doom clones instead. But the exorbitant costs and 4 years spent on its development salted the wound further. Those FMVs weren't outsourced, they were made in-house, and the developers themselves have reported wasting time away from working on the game to work on those videos instead. Looking Glass's quote-unquote thinking man shooters never did sell well, but they did maintain a respectable niche, including Force Centauri. But between its delay into 1996, the decision to invest so much in cutscenes that weren't worth the return, and the departure of the game's original designer, it was victimized by bad luck, unfortunate circumstances, and a small handful of bad behind-the-scenes decisions, rather than from the team shipping a low-quality product. Its commercial failure ended up canceling their plan to have other games set place in the Terra Nova universe, an IP they were already eager to exploit with a tie-in novel that released shortly before the game. So I can only wonder how different the studio's future would have been, as well as the future of gaming today, if history had gone slightly different for this forgotten classic.